Imagine standing on the edge of a battlefield. The horizon darkens, not from clouds, from dust. The dust of 10,000 boots marching in perfect rhythm. You hear it before you see it, the mechanical thunder of iron and leather moving as one organism. No shouting, no chaos, just the cold, calculated sound of a machine designed to break you. This is not just an army, this is Rome, and Rome does not conquer through strength alone. Rome conquers through fear, through the deliberate, systematic destruction of the human will, through psychological terror so precise, so devastating that entire nations surrender before a single sword is drawn. For over 1,000 years, Rome did not merely defeat its enemies, it dismantled their minds. It weaponized fear, shame, and hopelessness. It engineered obedience. It turned warfare into psychological theater and the world into its stage. This is not a story of battles. This is a story of how terror became an empire. The Romans mastered the darkest art of all, the complete domination of the human psyche. Welcome to the psychology of Rome. Welcome to the machine that conquered the world by breaking it from the inside. Long before Rome's legions ever marched, the Romans understood something fundamental about human nature. Fear is more powerful than force. They built their empire not just with stone and steel, but with symbols, with messages, with carefully constructed images designed to colonize the mind before the body ever fell. Consider the Roman road, stretching across continents. Perfectly straight, impossibly engineered. You are a Gallic farmer, a Germanic tribesman, a shepherd in Anatolia. You stand beside this road and you understand immediately. Whoever built this is not like you. They possess knowledge you cannot comprehend, power you cannot challenge. They have bent the earth itself to their will. The road is not just infrastructure, it is a psychological weapon. It says, we are everywhere, we are eternal, and we are inevitable. Every Roman structure carries this message. The aqueducts that seem to defy gravity, the forums that dwarf your largest temples, the bridges that span distances your people believe impossible. Rome does not simply build, it overwhelms. It creates environments that make resistance feel absurd. And then there are the monuments. After every victory, Rome erects arches, columns, temples. These are not mere celebrations. They are permanent installations of dominance. The Arch of Titus, depicting the sack of Jerusalem. Trajan's columns spiraling with scenes of Dacian carnage. These monuments stand for centuries, shouting the same message to every generation. This is what happens when you defy Rome. The psychological impact is devastating. You cannot escape Roman power even in memory. Every stone, every inscription, every carved scene of submission is a reminder that Rome has already won. Not just the last war, every war, forever, but the architecture of terror extends. Beyond stone, the Romans understood theatrical presentation. When their armies approached a city, they did so with deliberate ceremony. Legions marched in perfect formation, not because it was tactically necessary, because it was terrifying. The sight of thousands moving as one, without individual will, without human chaos, suggested something inhuman, something unstoppable. The standardization itself was psychological warfare. Every legionary wore the same armor, carried the same weapons, maintained the same discipline. This uniformity erased individuality. It said, these are not men, this is a machine. How do you fight a machine? How do you reason with it? How do you appeal to its mercy? You don't. You surrender, or you die. The Romans also weaponized sound. The corn, the curved bronze horn blared signals across battlefields with a tone specifically designed to be unsettling. Not musical, not human. Something metallic and alien that cut through the fog of war and announced, Rome is here. Even Roman camps became psychological weapons. At the end of each day's march, legions would construct identical fortified camps, ramparts, ditches, gates, streets, all within hours. An enemy scout observing this would report back, they built a fortress in an afternoon. The implication was clear. Rome's power was not diminished by distance or fatigue. Rome could project absolute control anywhere, anytime. There was no safe distance, no refuge, no hope. This was the foundation. The Romans created an environment where fear was ambient, where every visual, every sound, every structure reinforced the same psychological reality. Resistance is futile. But this was just the beginning. Rome's greatest psychological innovation was not how it terrified its enemies, it was how it terrified its own soldiers. The Roman military was the most disciplined force in human history, but discipline is not natural. It must be engineered. It must be carved into the human psyche through methods so brutal, so psychologically devastating that obedience becomes reflexive. Enter Decimation, Decimation. When a Roman legion fled in battle, or mutiny, or failed catastrophically, the punishment was not exile or execution of the guilty. It was systematic internal terror. The legion would be divided into groups of 10. Each group would draw lots. The one who drew the shortest straw would be beaten to death by the other 9, with clubs, with their own hands, his friends, his tent mates, his brothers. Imagine the psychological architecture of this punishment. First, the randomness. It didn't matter if you personally failed or fled. The lottery made everyone equally guilty. This created a collective psychology of shared responsibility. Every man became the enforcer of discipline over every other man, because failure by anyone threatened everyone. Second, the intimacy of the execution. These were not strangers. These were men who had marched together, eaten together, fought together. Rome forced them to murder their own brothers. The psychological scarring was permanent. The survivors carried not just fear, but guilt, shame, and the knowledge that they were capable of anything Rome commanded. Third, the ratio. Only 1 in 10 died. The other 9 lived, but with the memory that they had killed to survive. This created a deeper loyalty to Rome than any speech or reward ever could. They were now complicit. They were not victims of Rome's brutality. They were participants in it. The message was clear. Rome owns you completely. Not just your obedience, but your soul. Decimation was rare, but it didn't need to happen often. The knowledge that it could happen was enough. Every legionary understood that Rome's greatest threat was not the enemy across the battlefield. It was Rome itself. This internal terror created something unprecedented: self-policing discipline. Roman soldiers did not follow orders because they believed in the cause, or loved their commander, or feared the enemy. They followed orders because every man around them was watching, because deviation meant not just personal death, but collective punishment, because the unit itself became a cage of mutual surveillance. Centurions did not need to be everywhere. The fear structure was decentralized. Every soldier became his own guard, and the guard of the men beside him. The legion policed itself through internalized terror, but Rome's psychological engineering went deeper still. The military oath. Sacramentum was not just a contract, it was a religious binding. Soldiers swore not just to Rome but to the gods. Breaking this oath meant not just legal punishment but cosmic damnation. Your betrayal would follow you into the afterlife. Your family would be cursed. Your name would be obliterated. Rome fused legal, military, and spiritual terror into one unbreakable psychological chain, and the reward system reinforced this. Promotions, bonuses, land grants, all were tied to absolute obedience. But these were not just incentives. They were proof that Rome's system worked. That submission led to prosperity, that the only rational choice was total loyalty. The combination was devastating. Rome created soldiers who did not think, who did not question, who moved as extensions of a single will. Men who would march into certain death not because they were brave, but because disobedience was psychologically unthinkable. This was the machine, not just men in armor, but men whose minds had been rebuilt from the inside. And once this machine was perfected internally, Rome turned it outward, against a world that had no defense. Rome did not just defeat Carthage, Rome erased it. The Third Punic War was not about territory or resources or even revenge. It was about sending a message to the entire known world. This is what total defiance costs. Carthage had been broken twice before, its fleets destroyed, its armies shattered, its empire dismantled. By 149 BCE, Carthage was harmless, trading city, disarmed, paying tribute, posing no military threat. But Rome did not care about threats. Rome cared about symbols. Cato the Elder ended every speech in the Senate with the same phrase: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed, not defeated, not occupied, destroyed. The Senate agreed, not because Carthage was dangerous, but because Carthage still existed, and existence was defiance. The siege lasted 3 years. Roman forces surrounded the city completely. Food entered, no water, no hope. The Carthaginians ate leather. They ate their animals. They ate the dead. But Rome did not rush. Rome waited. The siege itself was psychological warfare. Every day the city stood was a day its population weakened, not just physically, but mentally. Hope died slowly. Resistance became madness. Surrender became impossible. Rome had already declared that Carthage would be annihilated. When the legions finally breached the walls, they did not simply kill. They performed. The soldiers moved through the city street by street, house by house. Not looting, not raging, methodically. They killed every living thing. Men, women, children, livestock, pets. They burned every structure, temples, homes, libraries, markets. This was not the chaos of sacking. This was systematic extermination, and Rome made sure the world watched. Representatives from other nations were invited to witness the final days, to see the smoke, to hear the screams, to understand what Roman victory. This was not conquest, this was demonstration. When Carthage was empty of life, Roman engineers tore down what remained of the walls. They demolished the foundations. They plowed the ruins. They sowed the earth with salt, or symbolic gesture that the land itself must be cursed, rendered forever barren. Every trace of Carthage was obliterated. Its people were sold into slavery or executed. Its culture was erased. Its name became a warning. But Rome's psychological mastery went further. After Carthage's destruction, Rome did not simply forget it. Rome commemorated. Monuments were built. Speeches were given. Poets wrote of Carthage's fall for centuries. The story was repeated, refined, amplified. Why? Because Rome understood that the true power of Carthage's destruction was not in the act itself. It was in the memory of the act. Every city that considered rebellion, every tribe that contemplated resistance, every king who thought about defying Roman demands now carried one image in their minds: Carthage burning, Carthage silent, Carthage gone. The message was final. Rome does not accept conditional surrender. Rome does not negotiate. Rome does not show mercy to those it has marked for destruction. Rome is not just stronger. Rome is eternal, and you are temporary. This was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Rome had created a legend of its own invincibility, not through propaganda lies, but through demonstrated absolute, irrevocable truth. The destruction of Carthage was not an end. It was a tool, a weapon Rome could wield forever without firing another arrow. Because the terror was now in the minds of everyone who heard the story. And in the ancient world, everyone heard the story. Resistance became not just dangerous, but irrational. How do you fight an enemy that does not just defeat you, but erases you from history? How do you rally your people when the only outcome is oblivion? You don't. You submit. You send tribute. Because Rome had proven that defiance was not just death, it was something worse. It was becoming nothing, forever. Rome did not invent crucifixion, but Rome perfected it. Other civilizations used execution as punishment. Rome used execution as communication. Crucifixion was never about the individual criminal, it was about the audience. It was public theater designed to implant terror so deep into the population that rebellion became psychologically impossible. The process was deliberate, methodical, every stage calibrated for maximum psychological impact. First, the condemned was scourged, whipped with a flagrum, whipped embedded with bone, metal, and glass that shredded flesh. This was not just punishment, it was weakening. The victim would lose massive amounts of blood, ensuring they would remain conscious during the crucifixion, but too damaged to struggle effectively. Then came the procession. The condemned was forced to carry the patibulum, the horizontal crossbeam, through the streets to the execution site. This served multiple purposes. It humiliated the victim publicly, it exhausted them further, and it advertised the execution, drawing crowds. Rome wanted witnesses, as many as possible. The crucifixion site was always chosen for visibility. Hilltops, roadsides, city gates, places where the maximum number of people would be forced to see. The victim was stripped naked. This was psychological as much as practical. Nudity removed identity. It reduced the condemned to flesh, to an object. It humiliated not just the individual, but their family, their tribe, their cause. Then they were nailed to the cross, not tied nailed, through the wrists or forearms and through the feet. The pain was unimaginable, but pain was not the goal. Duration was the goal. Crucifixion killed slowly. Victims could survive for days. The cause of death was typically asphyxiation. The position of the body made breathing difficult. To inhale, the victim had to push upward on the nails through their feet. Each breath became an act of excruciating effort. Eventually, exhaustion won, but the real horror was public. The crosses were positioned so everyone passing could see. Travelers, merchants, families, children. The message was inescapable. This is what happens when you defy Rome, and Rome crucified in mass quantities. After the Spartacus rebellion, 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, 6,000 bodies lining a major road. For weeks, anyone traveling to Rome walked past this corridor of death. The psychological impact was incalculable. First, the scale. Individual executions inspire sympathy. Mass executions inspire terror. They demonstrate that Rome does not value human life, that resistance is not heroic, it is suicide. Second, the decay. Bodies were not removed quickly. They were left to rot, to be torn by birds, to stink. This extended the spectacle. It made the punishment visible and visceral for far longer than the deaths themselves. Third, the denial of burial. In ancient cultures, proper burial was essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. By leaving bodies exposed, Rome denied the condemned not just life, but eternal rest. This added a spiritual dimension to the terror. You were not just killed, you were damned. The families of the crucified were forced to witness. They could not intervene. They could not retrieve the body. They could only watch. This broke families. Psychologically, it created trauma that spread through communities, and Rome ensured that everyone knew anyone can be crucified. Citizens had some protections, but non-citizens, slaves, rebels, foreigners, all were vulnerable. Crucifixion was not reserved for the worst crimes. It was applied broadly, arbitrarily, to remind populations that Roman mercy was a gift, not a right. The cross became Rome's signature, a symbol of absolute power. When Jesus of Nazareth was crucified centuries later, he was executed using a method that had already terrorized the Mediterranean world for generations. The cross was not chosen randomly. It was chosen because everyone understood what it meant: submission, or this. Crucifixion was Rome's darkest art. It turned execution into spectacle, pain into propaganda, death into a permanent installation of fear. And it worked. For centuries, populations across 3 continents lived in the shadow of the cross. They passed by execution sites. They averted their eyes but could not escape the knowledge: Rome is watching, Rome is waiting, and Rome does not forgive. This was not justice, this was psychological dominance. The engineering of a collective trauma so deep that entire generations learned to police their own thoughts, their own words, their own defiance, because the alternative was not just death, it was this. Rome did not celebrate military victories quietly. Rome turned them into rituals of psychological domination. The Roman triumph was not a parade, it was theater. Propaganda, a carefully choreographed demonstration of power designed to reinforce Rome's supremacy, both to its own citizens and to the defeated. Generals returning victorious from war did not simply enter Rome. They were granted a triumpha, procession through the city, that followed an ancient, rigid formula. Every element was symbolic. Every moment was calculated to maximize psychological impact. The day began at the edge of the city. The victorious general, dressed in the purple and gold regalia of Jupiter himself, rode in a gilded chariot pulled by 4 white horses. Behind him stood a slave, holding a laurel crown over his head and whispering in his ear, "Memento mori, remember, you are mortal." But no one in the crowd heard that whisper. They saw only the godlike figure, radiant and untouchable. Behind the chariot came the spoils. Wagons loaded with gold, silver, weapons, art, treasures looted from the conquered lands. These were not just displayed, they were paraded, slowly, deliberately, so every citizen could see the wealth Rome extracted from the world. This served a dual purpose. It demonstrated Rome's material power, and it justified the war. Look at what we have gained. Look at how Rome prospers through conquest. Then came the captives. Enemy kings, generals, nobles, anyone of status, were forced to walk in chains through the streets of Rome. They were dressed in their finest clothes, but shackled. Their dignity was left intact just enough to make their humiliation complete. The crowds jeered, spat, mocked. This was intentional. Rome wanted its citizens to see the mighty brought low, to internalize the message: no matter how powerful you were, Rome is greater. Some captives were executed at the end of the procession, strangled in the Tullian Rome's subterranean prison, while the triumph continued above. Their deaths were announced, and the crowd cheered. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was symbolic closure. The enemy was not just defeated, they were erased. Their power, their legacy, their existence ended in a Roman dungeon, while Rome celebrated above. But the psychological mastery went deeper. The triumph was public, free. Every citizen could attend. This was not a closed ceremony for elites. This was mass propaganda. Rome wanted its population to feel victorious, to see themselves as part of the conquering machine, to internalize Roman superiority. And it worked. Generations of Romans grew up witnessing these triumphs. They learned that Rome always won, that foreign kings always bowed, that resistance always ended in chains. The triumph created a cult of victory, a national psychology where Roman dominance was not opinion, it was observable fact, empirical, undeniable. You saw it with your own eyes every time a general returned. For foreign peoples, the knowledge of the triumph was devastating. Imagine you are a Germanic chieftain, a Gallic king, a Greek philosopher. You have heard the stories. You know that if Rome defeats you, You will not simply die in battle. You will be dragged to Rome in chains, paraded like an animal, displayed to 1,000,000 jeering Romans, executed in a hole beneath the city while they celebrate your death. Your dignity will be destroyed. Your legacy will become Roman entertainment. Your gods will watch you fall and do nothing. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. Rome did not just want military victory. Rome wanted spiritual victory, the total demoralization of enemy leadership. The message, you cannot win, and even dying with honor is not an option. Some leaders chose suicide over capture. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who led the last great resistance against Caesar, was imprisoned for 6 years before being executed during Caesar's triumph. 6 years in darkness, waiting to be displayed and strangled for Roman amusement. Others surrendered early, hoping for mercy. Some received it, some did not. The unpredictability added, and in the layer of psychological pressure, defiance guaranteed horror, submission might bring mercy. The calculation was agonizing, but the triumph was not just for foreign leaders. It was for Roman commanders. Generals competed for triumphs. It was the highest honor, the pinnacle of a military career. This created a perverse incentive. Wars were started, prolonged, and escalated not for strategic necessity, but for glory. Commanders sought enemies worthy of a triumph. They inflated their victories. They exaggerated threats. They turned military campaigns into personal quests for the ultimate public validation, and the Senate weaponized this. Granting or denying a triumph became a tool of political control. Generals who were too ambitious, too popular, too dangerous denied. Loyal generals celebrated. The triumph was not just propaganda for the masses. It was a mechanism of internal discipline for Rome's military elite. Ambition was channeled, controlled, directed always toward one goal: expanding Roman power. The triumph lasted for centuries. Even as Rome transitioned from republic to empire, the ritual continued. Emperors held triumphs not because they personally commanded armies, but because the symbolism was too powerful to abandon. Victory was not just a military outcome. It was a religious experience, a reaffirmation of Rome's divine mandate, a collective ritual that bound the population to the state. And every time a triumph occurred, Rome reminded the world, we are invincible. Not because we claim it, but because you have seen it. You have watched your leaders bow, and you will bow too. Rome's legions were unstoppable on the battlefield, but Rome's true genius was never letting battles happen in the first place. The most powerful psychological weapon in Rome's arsenal was not terror. It was division. Rome understood that empires do not fall from external pressure. They collapse from internal fracture. And Rome became the master of engineering that fracture in its enemies before the war even began. The strategy was simple: never face a united enemy. When Rome encountered a powerful kingdom, it did not immediately invade. It studied, it gathered intelligence, it identified the fault lines, tribal rivalries, ethnic tensions, religious differences, succession disputes, economic disparities. Then Rome exploited them. Consider Gaul. When Caesar arrived, Gaul was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of tribes: Aedui, Arverni, Sequani, Helvetii, with their own territories, leaders, and grievances. Some were allies, some were enemies. All were proud. Caesar did not conquer Gaul through superior military force alone. He conquered it through alliance management. He befriended the Aedui. He painted them as civilized, sophisticated, Rome's natural partners. He gave them trade deals, protection, status. The Aedui became psychologically invested in Roman success. Their identity became tied to their relationship with Rome. Meanwhile, Caesar framed other tribes, particularly the Arverni and their leader Vercingetorix, as threats, not just to Rome but to the Aedui. He positioned Roman intervention as defense, not conquest. The psychological impact was devastating. Gallic tribes spent as much energy fighting each other as resisting Rome, and because they were fighting each other, they never formed the unified front necessary to expel Roman forces. When Vercingetorix finally managed to unite several tribes, it was too late. The divisions Caesar had deepened over years could not be healed in months. Distrust remained, coordination failed. Rome won, but the strategy went deeper. Rome perfected the art of client states. These were kingdoms and tribes allowed to maintain nominal independence, their own kings, their own laws, but bound to Rome through treaties. On the surface, this seemed generous. Rome was not annexing territory, it was respecting sovereignty. In reality, it was psychological colonization. Client states owed military support to Rome. They paid tribute. They could not conduct foreign policy independently. Their kings knew they ruled only with Rome's approval. And if they displeased Rome, Rome would simply back a rival claimant to the throne. This created a psychology of dependence. Client kings became invested in Roman stability. Their power was tied to Rome's power. They policed their own populations on Rome's behalf, not because they loved Rome, but because their survival depended on it. Rome created a class of foreign rulers who were simultaneously kings and prisoners. They lived in golden cages, and they defended those cages because the alternative was not freedom, was irrelevance or death. The psychological trap was perfect. Resist Rome and you face the legions. Submit to Rome and you become Rome's agent. There was no third option. Rome also weaponized identity itself. In conquered regions, Rome offered citizenship selectively, not to everyone, not immediately, but strategically, to elites, to loyalists, to those who proved their value to Rome. This created a hierarchy of belonging. Citizenship was status, it was protection, it was access, and it was exclusive. Local populations learned that advancement required assimilation. If you adopted Roman customs, spoke Latin, served in Roman auxilia, you could rise. Your children could become citizens. Your family could join the empire's elite. But if you clung to your traditions, your language, your gods, remained second class, taxed more heavily, denied legal protections, excluded from power. This was not forced assimilation. It was incentivized assimilation. Rome did not need to destroy local cultures. It simply made Roman culture more valuable, more useful. Generations of conquered peoples voluntarily abandoned their identities, not because they were forced, but because the reward structure made it rational, and Rome was patient. It did not expect immediate loyalty. It built it slowly, over decades, by creating conditions where loyalty was self-interest. The result was an empire where the conquered policed themselves, where local elites enforced Roman law more brutally than Romans did, where rebellion became not just militarily difficult but socially impossible because the population was divided between collaborators and resistors. Rome's enemies were never just external. Rome engineered enemies within enemy societies. It turned brother against brother, tribe against tribe, generation against generation. And the psychological brilliance was this: the divisions felt organic. They felt like natural tensions. Rome's hand was invisible. Communities blamed themselves, blamed each other, never realizing they were being manipulated by a system designed to keep them weak, fractured, and dependent. This was Rome's darkest genius. It did not just conquer land, it conquered possibility. It made resistance feel not just dangerous, but unimaginable. Because even if you wanted to resist, who would you fight alongside? Who could you trust? By the time you realized the answer was no one, it was too late. Rome had already won, not with swords, but with psychology. In 82 BCE, Lucius Cornelius Sulla did something unprecedented. He did not just defeat his political enemies, he formalized their murder. The proscription was Rome's invention, a legal mechanism that turned assassination into state policy. The concept was simple and horrifying. Sulla published lists of names, hundreds of them, senators, generals, businessmen, citizens, anyone Sulla deemed an enemy of the state. And then he announced the rules. Anyone on the list was to be killed on sight. No trial, no defense, no appeal. Any citizen could murder a prescribed person and claim a reward, 12,000 denarii per head. The killer could also claim the victim's property. Suddenly, political opposition became not just dangerous, it became profitable. But the psychological architecture of the proscription went far beyond the immediate killings. First, the lists were updated. New names appeared daily. This created an atmosphere of perpetual terror. You could wake up alive and by evening be marked for death. There was no safety, no stability, no way to know if you were secure. Second, the accusations were opaque. Sulla did not need to prove anything. The list was the proof. If your name appeared, you were guilty. Of what? It didn't matter. Disloyalty, suspicion, being too wealthy, having the wrong friends. The vagueness was intentional. It made everyone vulnerable. It destroyed trust. If you didn't know what made someone guilty, you couldn't protect yourself. You could only submit completely. Third, the proscriptions incentivized betrayal. Your neighbor could kill you and take your house. Your business partner could murder you and claim your assets. Your own slaves could turn you in for freedom and a reward. The social fabric disintegrated. Rome became a city of informants and assassins. People stopped speaking openly. They stopped gathering. They stopped trusting in you. This was not chaos. This was controlled terror. Sulla was engineering compliance through ambient fear. He did not need to kill everyone. He only needed to kill enough to make everyone else obedient. The proscriptions were eventually ended. Sulla retired, confident that his enemies were eliminated and his allies secured. But the tool was not forgotten. Decades later, the second triumvirate, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Leppa, have the proscriptions. 300 senators, 2,000 equestrians, thousands more ordinary citizens, all marked for death. This time the lists were even more cynical. Triumvirs placed their own enemies on the lists, but they also traded names. Antony wanted someone dead? He'd put them on the list. Octavian wanted someone's property? They'd go on the list. The proscriptions became a negotiation tool among Rome's most powerful men. Human lives were bargaining chips. And Rome's population watched. They learned. They internalized. The lesson was clear. Power in Rome is absolute. There is no law. There is no protection. There is only the will of whoever holds the swords. But the psychological impact extended beyond Rome itself. The proscriptions sent a message to every Roman province, every client king, every potential rebel. This is what Rome does to its own citizens. Imagine what it will do to you if Rome would murder its own senators, men of wealth, status, and citizenship. What mercy would it show a foreign enemy? What restraint would it demonstrate toward a conquered people? None. The proscriptions proved that Rome's brutality knew no limits. Not even its own laws, its own people, its own elite were safe. This created a civilization-wide psychology of submission. Resistance was not just militarily futile, it was existentially futile, because Rome had demonstrated that it would destroy anything and anyone to maintain power. There was no negotiating with Rome, no reasoning with it, no appealing to shared humanity. Rome was a machine, and machines do not feed. The proscriptions also redefined Roman politics. After Sulla, after the triumvirate, every Roman citizen understood that political conflict could escalate to mass murder at any moment. This created a culture of extreme caution, silence, self-censorship. The Senate became a theater of performance. Senators said what they thought the powerful wanted to hear. They voted how they were, and expected to vote. They praised emperors they despised and condemned allies they loved, because the alternative was the list. This was psychological engineering on a societal scale. Rome had created a population conditioned to obey, not through belief, but through internalized trauma. The memory of the proscriptions lived in every Roman's mind, passed down through generations, a permanent installation of fear. And emperors later would leverage this memory. They didn't need to issue new proscriptions. They only needed to threaten them, to let it be known that they could, that the power still existed. The ghost of the proscriptions haunted Rome for centuries. It was the ultimate tool of psychological control, not violence itself, but the possibility of violence. The knowledge that at any moment, for any reason, you could be marked, hunted, erased. This was Rome's mastery. It did not rule through love or loyalty. It ruled through fear so deep, so embedded that rebellion was not just dangerous, it was psychologically impossible. Because Rome had proven it would destroy anything to survive, including itself. Rome did not just demand obedience, it demanded worship. The Imperial Cult was not a religion in a traditional sense. It was a psychological weapon disguised as theology. It began with Julius Caesar. After his assassination, his adopted son Octavian later, Augustus declared Caesar a god, Divus Julius, the divine Julius. Temples were built, priests were appointed, rituals were established. This was not metaphor, this was official state policy. Caesar was literally, legally, theologically, a god. And if Caesar was a god, then his or Augustus was the son of a god. The implications were staggering. Augustus did not claim divinity during his lifetime. He was too clever for that, but he allowed the provinces to worship him. In the East, where divine kingship was already a tradition, Augustus was declared a god immediately. Temples rose, festivals were held, prayers were offered. In Rome itself, Augustus was more subtle. He was Princeps' first citizen. He wore the toga, not a crown. He called the Senate his colleagues, but everyone understood. The son of a god was not a man, and questioning the son of a god was not politics, it was blasphemy. The psychological control this provided was absolute. Traditionally, you could oppose a king, critique a policy, debate a law, but you cannot debate a god. You cannot oppose divinity. To resist the emperor was to resist the will of heaven itself. This transformed political dissent into spiritual crime. Rebellion was not just illegal, it was immoral. It was cosmic disorder. You were not just defying Rome, you were defying the gods. And Rome was very good at punishing blasphemy. The Imperial Cult also created a mechanism of loyalty testing. Across the empire, citizens were required to participate in public sacrifices to the emperor's genius. his divine spirit. This was not optional. It was civic duty. Magistrates, soldiers, citizens, all were expected to perform the ritual. Refusing was treason, but it was also sacrilege. This became a tool of identifying resistance. Christians, in particular, refused to sacrifice to the emperor, not because they opposed Rome politically, but because their theology forbade worshiping anyone but their own God. Rome did not care about the theology. Rome cared about the refusal, because refusal to worship the emperor was proof of disloyalty, and disloyalty was death. The genius of the Imperial Cult was that it made loyalty visible. You could not hide your allegiance. You had to publicly declare it, in front of witnesses, in front of authorities. This destroyed underground resistance. You could not quietly oppose Rome while publicly pretending compliance. The ritual forced you to choose, submit spiritually or die. But the cult was not just about control. It was about psychological colonization. When you worship someone, you internalize their authority. You do not just obey, you believe. You stop seeing the emperor as a man who might be wrong. You see him as a divine figure whose will is inherently righteous. The Imperial Cult reprogrammed populations at a fundamental level. It turned subjects into believers, and believers do not rebel. This was especially powerful in the provinces. Rome allowed conquered peoples to keep their gods, their temples, their rituals, but it added one requirement: the emperor must be included. Local pantheons were expanded. The emperor became another god among many. This seemed like tolerance, like respect for local traditions, but it was assimilation. Over generations, the emperor was no longer a foreign occupier. He was part of the divine order. His authority was not just political, it was cosmic, eternal. Resisting Rome became resisting reality itself. The Imperial Cult also provided a social mechanism of integration. Festivals, games, sacrifices, these were public events. They brought communities together. They created shared experiences, shared identities, and all of it centered on Rome. You did not just live under Roman rule, you celebrated Roman rule. You thanked the gods, including the emperor, for peace, for prosperity, for order, even if that peace was enforced by legions, even if that prosperity was built on conquest, even if that order was maintained by crucifixion. The cult rewrote the narrative. Rome was not an occupier. Rome was a gift, a blessing, a divine mandate. And if you questioned that, you were not just a rebel, you were insane. You were denying obvious reality. You were rejecting the gods themselves. This was the ultimate psychological weapon. Rome did not just control your body or your city. Rome controlled meaning itself. It defined what was true, what was sacred, what was possible. Resistance became not just dangerous, it became incoherent. Because how do you fight a god? How do you organize rebellion against the divine order? How do you inspire people to risk their lives for a cause that heaven itself opposes? You don't. You bow. You sacrifice. You worship. And Rome endures, not through force alone, but through the complete and total colonization of the human soul. By the 1st century CE, Rome had done something unprecedented. It had stopped expanding, not because it could not conquer more, but because it no longer needed to. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was the culmination of centuries of psychological warfare. Rome had achieved what every empire dreams of: submission without ongoing violence, obedience without constant. The world had learned to fear Rome so completely that resistance felt not dangerous, but absurd. The Pax Romana was not peace in the traditional sense. There were still revolts, still local conflicts, still crucifixions along the roads, but the age felt peaceful, because Rome was no longer fighting great wars. There were no rival empires, no existential threats. Rome was simply eternal, unchangeable, and that was the point. Rome had engineered a collective psychology across 3 continents. This is how the world is. This is how it has always been. This is how it will always be. Generations grew up under Roman rule. They never knew a world without Rome. They could not imagine one. Their grandparents had stories of resistance, but those were stories. Ancient history, irrelevant to the present. Rome was not a temporary occupation. Rome was reality. This psychological shift was devastating to potential resistance. How do you organize rebellion against reality? How do you inspire people to fight for something they cannot even conceptualize? The roads Rome built decades earlier now carried merchants, not armies. The peace allowed trade to flourish. The economy grew. Cities expanded. People prospered. And they credited Rome, not because Rome deserved credit, but because Rome was the only constant, the only structure that spanned the known world, the only system that provided stability. The Pax Romana became self-reinforcing. The longer peace lasted, the the more terrifying the prospect of its ending became. War meant uncertainty, chaos, the collapse of the trade routes, the currency, the legal system. Even those who despised Rome feared its collapse. This was Rome's darkest achievement. It had made itself necessary, not loved, not wanted, but indispensable. The provinces no longer dreamed of independence. They dreamed of better integration, better access to Roman markets, better roads, better favor from the emperor. Resistance movements that did emerge were not fighting for something. They were fighting against something. And fighting against is harder. It requires more energy, more sacrifice, for a less clear reward. What would replace Rome? Tribalism, local warlords, chaos? Most people chose Rome, even when they hated it. The Pax Romana also created a new kind of power, bureaucratic inevitability. Rome's legal system was vast, complex, inescapable. Every transaction, every property, every dispute passed through Roman mechanisms. Judges, tax collectors, magistrates. These were not soldiers, they were administrators. But they were just as powerful, because Rome had colonized procedure. You could not buy land without Roman law, could not settle a dispute without Roman courts, could not conduct trade without Roman currency. Rome was embedded in every aspect of daily life, not as a conqueror, but as the framework of civilization itself. Resisting Rome meant resisting everything, withdrawing from trade, abandoning your property, living outside the law, and no one was willing to do that. So Rome endured, not because people loved it, but because people had forgotten how to live without it. The psychological programming was complete. Rome had transitioned from a military threat to an ambient reality, from something you resisted to something you simply accepted. And acceptance was the final stage of conquest, because when people accept the conqueror, they stop being conquered. They become collaborator, participant. They defend the system because their lives are built on it. This was Rome's ultimate victory. It had made itself so essential, so totalizing, so inescapable, that even those who hated Rome could not imagine its end. And so Rome did not need terror. It did not need proscriptions or crucifixions or decimations. It simply was. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Rome fell, eventually. But the psychology it engineered did not. For 1,000 years after Rome's collapse, Europe remained haunted by its memory. Kings called themselves Caesar. Emperors claimed Roman legitimacy. Borders were drawn based on old provincial maps. The Holy Roman Empire, Byzantium, the Ottomans, the Tsars, all invoked Rome, all borrowed its symbols, its language, its architecture, because Rome had embedded itself not just in history but in imagination. It had become the archetype of empire, the standard against which all power was measured, and its methods were never forgotten. The proscription became the purge. The triumph became the military parade. The imperial cult became state religion. Decimation became collective punishment. Every empire that followed studied Rome, learned from Rome, imitated Rome, because Rome had proven that psychological terror worked, that fear could be systematized, that populations could be conditioned to accept tyranny as normalcy. Rome's legacy is not its roads or its aqueducts. It is its methods, the weaponization of fear, the engineering of obedience, the division of enemies, the cult of power. These are still with us. Every authoritarian regime, every totalitarian state, every empire of the modern age uses Rome's playbook, sometimes consciously, sometimes instinctively, but always effectively, because Rome discovered something fundamental about human nature, that fear is more powerful than hope, that division is easier than unity, that people will worship power if you make them believe it is inevitable. Rome did not just conquer the ancient world, it conquered the future. Its methods are immortal, not because they are good, but because they work. And that is Rome's final, darkest victory. Long after its legions disbanded, long after its emperors fell, long after its language faded, Rome's psychology endures. In every government that terrorizes its people, in every regime that weaponizes spectacle, in every system that makes submission feel rational, Rome is still here. Not in marble, but in minds, and perhaps it always will be. Conclusion. The machine that never stopped stand again on that battlefield. The horizon dark with dust, the sound of iron boots, the silence before the storm. Now you understand. This is not just an army. This is a system, a machine built over centuries to dismantle the human will, to make resistance feel impossible, to make submission feel inevitable. Rome conquered the world not through military genius alone, but through the mastery of fear, through the systematic application of terror, division, spectacle, and psychological conditioning. Every tool Rome used, from decimation to crucifixion, from triumph to proscription, from divinity to bureaucracy, was designed with one purpose: total domination, not just of land, but of thought, of possibility, of hope. Rome understood that the greatest victories are psychological, that fear embedded in memory is more powerful than imposed by force, that a population that polices itself is more docile than one controlled by soldiers. And Rome perfected this for centuries across continents. The result was an empire that outlasted armies, that survived disasters, that endured long after its emperors were forgotten. Because Rome was never just a place, it was a method. And that method still shapes our world, still echoes in our systems, still whispers in the dark corners of power. Rome proved that terror works, that manipulation works, that the complete psychological domination of entire civilizations is not only possible, it is sustainable. And that, more than any legion, more than any conquest, is Rome's true legacy, the machine that broke the world and changed it forever.